Good afternoon. I'm David Luberoff, the Joint Center's Director of Fellowships and Events, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to this, our penultimate event in our Spring 2024 Housing Research Seminar. Today's talk, as you know, will focus on whether new suburban housing is likely to make urban areas more affordable. Before I introduce today's speaker, a couple of announcements. As I said, this is the next to last of the events in this series. Next week, we'll close out our Spring Housing Research Seminar with a presentation by Carlos Martin, who directs our Remodeling Futures program, and Claudia Solari, a senior research associate at the Urban Institute, talking about work that they did on housing resilience since Katrina struck New Orleans and the and surrounding communities. That's a paper that was recently published by the Urban Institute. That'll be the last of our spring events, but you should stay on our mailing list. The next major event we'll have will be the mid-June release of our annual State of the Nation's Housing Report. That hasn't been scheduled yet, but it will be in mid to late June. More information about those events and other activities and publications is available on our website. Now on to today's talk, which features Valentine Gilbert, a doctoral student in public policy who is one of the Joint Center's Meyer Doctoral Fellows. Valentine will be speaking about research he did with Robert French, asking whether continued suburban expansion can alleviate rising housing costs in urban areas, or whether urban centers will have to grow denser to become more affordable. He'll talk for about 35 to 40 minutes. After he's done, I'll moderate a Q&A using questions that you submit using Zoom's Q&A feature. Apologies in advance if we don't get to all of your questions. Typically, we have more questions than we have time. I will share your questions with Valentine, and he may decide to follow up with you. We will end right around 1:15 p.m. Video of the talk, as well as copies of Valentine's slides, will be posted by early next week. And Valentine will also be publishing a blog and paper by Valentine. The paper is the paper that he'll be talking about today. Valentine, it's all yours.
Right. Hi, everyone. And thank you so much for that introduction, David. Great. Hopefully you all can see my screen. I just want to say I'm really excited to tell you about this work, and I'm really grateful to the Joint Center for supporting this work and for having me here to share it. This is work that Robert and I have done on whether suburban housing supply impacts urban affordability, and we're looking at evidence from residential vacancy chains. I'll describe what those are shortly, but I want to start by saying that this work is motivated by a fact that I'm sure everybody attending is well aware of, which is that it's just become very expensive to live in major US cities. So since 1990, real rents in major US metro areas increased by 30%. And in sort of the densest neighborhoods of these cities, the 10% of neighborhoods closest to the city center, real rents increased by 45%. Now, these rising housing costs in cities, of course, impact everybody, but we're perhaps most concerned about low and middle income households who, when faced with these rising costs, don't really have the option of consuming less housing and instead are priced out of cities, which have historically been sort of engines of upward mobility. So there are a couple of reasons for this large rise in housing costs. First, since the early 2000s, there's been a big increase in the demand to live in urban centers, especially among high-income households. And second, the supply of housing in these dense urban areas is relatively inelastic, so it hasn't kept up with rising demand, whether it's because of regulatory constraints or the existing density of development. It's just very difficult and expensive to build new housing in these dense urban areas. By contrast, it's relatively cheap and easy to build new housing in the low-density suburban areas surrounding this dense urban core. So as a result, the elasticity of housing supply in these low-density suburbs is pretty high. And because of this, there's been a disproportionate increase in the supply of suburban housing. So these kinds of low-density suburban neighborhoods in 1990 contained less than half of the country's metro housing stock, but since then have accounted for more than 80% of the growth of the metro area housing stock. So we have what is widely regarded as an urban housing affordability crisis, driven in large part by the difficulty and expense of building new housing in these dense urban areas. And at the same time, on the periphery of these dense urban areas are neighborhoods where it's very cheap and easy to build. And this sort of naturally raises the question that we're interested in: can expanding suburban housing supply lower urban housing costs? So can we build lots and lots of new suburban housing, and in doing that, shift demand away from cities and make them more affordable places to live, especially for low and middle income households? Now, this question is the subject of an ongoing policy debate. On one side of the debate, we have what we might call the supply skeptics, whose position is sort of encapsulated by this headline in the New Republic: more building won't make housing affordable. And this is really a claim about who benefits from new housing. So the argument is that building new market rate housing, which tends to be more expensive and affordable only by high income households, that's not going to do much to lower housing costs for low and middle income households that can't directly afford this newly constructed housing. And the implicit assumption here is that housing submarkets are really segmented. There's just not that much mobility and substitution between different kinds of housing submarkets. On the other side of the debate, we have what we might call the market urbanists, whose position is sort of encapsulated by this New York Times headline: build, 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 build. And the argument here is that no, in fact, there's lots of substitution between housing submarkets. Households are really mobile. And because of that, all we have to do is increase the aggregate supply of housing, and that's going to lower housing costs for everybody. So you build expensive new housing, households move into that, and they free up older housing that's more affordable for middle income households and lower income households. So our question is directly relevant to this debate. We think it's an important question, one that's important for housing policy. And that raises the question, why hasn't this question been answered yet? Well, one reason is it's just very hard to answer this question with the standard approach that an applied economist might take. So we need some variation in the supply of housing from something like a natural experiment, and then we'd use that variation to see how changes in housing supply lead to substitution between different housing submarkets. And because there are lots of different housing submarkets, this quickly becomes a high-dimensional problem. And it's just very difficult to credibly answer this question with this approach. We get around the challenges of this standard approach by taking a sort of alternative approach that is more directly data-driven and really exploits this incredibly detailed data that we have access to, which we use to construct what are called residential vacancy chains. I'll describe exactly what those are on the next slide, but essentially what we're doing is looking directly at the data to see how households substitute between different kinds of housing units. We then use a simulation exercise to understand what those patterns of substitution that we see in the data tell us about the impact of building one kind of new housing on housing costs in other submarkets. So this all hinges on the idea of a vacancy chain. So what exactly is a vacancy chain? Well, briefly, it's a series of moves across housing units initiated by a new housing unit. So maybe we have a new single-family suburban home that was built in 2010. This initiates the vacancy chain, and the first sort of link or round of moves of this chain consists of moves into this newly built unit. So the unit is built, somebody moves in, and in moving, they leave their origin unit vacant. That's the first link of the chain. In the second link, somebody moves into that vacated origin unit, and in moving, they leave their origin unit vacant, and so on. And we can build out these chains, and in doing that, trace the impact of this new single-family suburban home on different submarkets. So what would it look like if housing markets were not very segmented versus if they are segmented? What are we looking for when we build out these vacancy chains? Well, if housing markets are very segmented and we build a new single-family suburban home, we would expect that if we trace out this vacancy chain, we're going to see lots of moves in very similar neighborhoods to the neighborhood in which the new suburban home was built. So lots of moves across low-density suburban neighborhoods. If, on the other hand, there's lots of mobility across submarkets, we'd expect this chain to reach perhaps into urban housing markets. So that's how we build the vacancy chains. What do we find? To give you a quick preview of our results, in the first part of this paper, we find that vacancy chains, if they continue on long enough, do in fact connect housing submarkets. So if we build out that chain from starting with the suburban unit, we do end up in high density urban neighborhoods. But vacancy chains are very short. They usually end within a few rounds of moves. I'll talk a little bit about why vacancy chains end, but because they're so short, building new suburban housing doesn't lead to that many moves in high density urban neighborhoods. So every 100 new suburban homes that are built leads to only 1.5 vacancies in low income urban tracts, the kinds of neighborhoods where we're perhaps most concerned about rising housing costs. And to quickly clarify a potential point of confusion when I'm talking about creating vacancies in different neighborhoods, I'm not talking about housing units being vacated and then sitting vacant. Instead, I'm talking about a housing unit that's vacated so that somebody else can move in. So that's what we find in the data. And then when we conduct our simulation exercise to help us interpret it, what we find is that the number of vacancies that are created in any given neighborhood by newly constructed housing in some other neighborhood, that strongly predicts the impact that that new housing construction has on housing costs in that neighborhood. So neighborhoods that get more vacancies see a greater fall in housing costs. And so the upshot of this is where we build and what kind of housing we build matters. Who benefits from new housing depends a lot on what kind of housing we're building and where we build it. So a roadmap of the rest of the talk. Next, I'm going to tell you about our data and how we use that to construct vacancy chains. Then I'm going to describe what the vacancy chains look like in the data. Then I'll tell you about our simulation exercise and the results, and then I'll conclude. So moving on to the data, this is really sort of an exciting part of this project. As you might imagine, constructing these vacancy chains, the data requirements are really high. You have to not only observe where people are living, where they moved from, you also have to observe that for lots of people, because when somebody leaves a unit, you have to see who's taking their place. We're really fortunate to have access to data that meets those requirements. So to build our vacancy chains, we're linking individuals across several restricted Census Bureau data sources. Now, the two most important sources for our analysis are both derived from something called the master address file. This is the Census Bureau's inventory of housing units in the US. So every housing unit in the US, they use this to administer the decennial censuses, the ACS, and all their other data products. And we're using a 2022 extract of the master address file. That's a snapshot of all the housing units in the country that exist in the master address file as of 2022. We then link that with individuals' residential histories, which we construct from something called the auxiliary reference file. So this file in each year from 2000 to 2021 has, for every individual in the US, their associated housing unit ID. And by linking all these years together, we're able to construct each person's residential history. We then link individuals' age, race, and ethnicity using the full count decennial censuses. And we characterize where people live and where housing units are located based on tract level characteristics calculated from the American Community Surveys. There are a couple of important housing unit characteristics that we don't directly observe in our data, but we're able to impute. So the first of these is housing unit age. We need to be able to tell when a unit is new versus when it's old. And to impute this, we're just going to take the first year that a housing unit ID is observed in the residential histories. So maybe from 2000 to 2009, this ID doesn't exist. Then we observe it in 2010, and we observe it in all the subsequent years. So that tells us that that unit was built and first occupied in 2010. The second characteristic that we need to impute is building size. So we want to distinguish between single-family housing and multifamily housing. And to do this, we're just going to take all the housing unit IDs that are associated with the same street address, which is something we observe in the master address file extract, and say that's the size of the building. So if there are 10 housing unit IDs with the same street address, this is a 10-unit building. So that's our data. How do we use this to build our vacancy chains? So I'm going to walk you through how these vacancy chains are constructed in a bit more detail now. But like I was saying before, these vacancy chains are initiated by the construction of a new housing unit. So we have, for example, a new unit that wasn't in our data before 2010, but then appears in the data. The first link of the chain, we find the person who's living there, trace them back to the previous year and see where they were living. That's the first link. The second link, we look for their origin unit in the following year, see who's living there and trace them back to their origin unit, and so on. So we keep building out the chain in this way. It can get kind of complicated. So we can have a case where one vacancy creates many vacancies, as in the case where two households consolidate in order to fill a single vacancy, leaving multiple vacancies behind. And you can also have many vacancies creating a single vacancy, as in the case where a single household splits into two households, filling two vacancies, but leaving only one behind. Now, in principle, we can build out these vacancy chains sort of indefinitely, but in practice, vacancy chains end. And this is really important because one of our key findings is that vacancy chains are short, and they can end for multiple reasons. First, and maybe most commonly, a chain ends if a move doesn't create a vacant unit. So somebody moves into a vacated unit, but in moving, they leave no vacancy behind. That might happen if, say, an adult child is living with their parents, moves into their own place, they fill the vacancy, but there's no vacancy left behind. Another way that a chain can end is if there's a move from abroad. So somebody moves into a vacated unit, but we can't find their housing unit in the data because it's not in the country, or if they're moving in from group quarters. Then a chain can also end if the vacated unit doesn't become occupied. So somebody moves into a vacancy, they vacate their origin unit, but when we look for that origin unit in the next year, nobody's living there. So the chain ends, or at least it ends if we're building out vacancy chains over a one-year horizon. But one thing we do is build chains over multiple horizons. So for example, if we were to build a vacancy chain over a two-year horizon, if we don't find somebody in 2010, we can search in the following year, search in 2011, see if somebody's moving, see if somebody's living there. And if so, we continue to build out the chain from that point. And we do this building chains up to a four-year horizon. And this allows us to not only trace out how different kinds of new housing impact different housing submarkets, but also how those connections unfold over time. So that's how we build our vacancy chains. And we do this for two different kinds of new housing in large metro areas in the US between 2009 and 2018. So the first kind of housing we're looking at is low density suburban single family housing. So these are new housing units, single family housing units built in below median density tracts outside the metro area's principal city. So new housing built in the kinds of tracts shown in blue in the map of Boston. And we're able to construct about 1.2 million chains initiated by this kind of new housing. And we're looking at this specific kind of housing because it directly impacts, or it's directly relevant to our research question of how new suburban housing impacts urban affordability. The second kind of housing that we look at is high-income urban multifamily housing. So we look at this second kind of housing because it gives us a point of comparison for the suburban vacancy chains, but also because this is the kind of housing that has been looked at in the existing literature on vacancy chains. So it allows us to compare our results to some of the existing results. And these vacancy chains, they're initiated by new housing units located in 20+ unit buildings in above median income tracts within 5 miles of the city center. So these are new units in multi-unit buildings in the kinds of tracts shown in red in the map of Boston. And we get about 360,000 chains initiated by this kind of new housing construction. Now, for both of these kinds of chains, ultimately what we're going to do is follow them and see how many vacancies they create in low-income urban tracts. So these are tracts in the top decile of density in below median income. So the kinds of tracts shown in purple in the map of Boston. Okay, so we build out these vacancy chains. Now I'll tell you what they look like in the data. So I'm going to start by focusing on high-income urban multifamily housing, or chains initiated by that kind of housing. So we've got 356,000 chains initiated by this new urban housing. And one way we might characterize these chains is by looking, okay, for each link of the chain or each migration round, what share of people moving in that round are moving from a neighborhood with a given characteristic? So on the x-axis, we have migration round. On the y-axis, we have the share of movers in that round moving from a neighborhood with a given characteristic. For example, in the first round of moves, so these are moves directly into the newly constructed housing, 14% of movers are moving from below median income tracts. So these are moves into high income urban multifamily units that are from below median income tracts. In the second round of moves, these are moves into the units vacated in the first round of moves. And the share of movers coming from below median income tracts increases to 20% in the second round. And as we continue to build out the chain, by the time we get to round 6, the share of movers who are coming from below median income tracts has increased to 37%. We see a similar pattern for households moving out of the bottom quintile income tracts. So only 6% of first round movers who are moving directly into the newly constructed housing are moving out of bottom quintile income tracts. That more than doubles by the time we get to the 6th round to 13%. And then for people moving out of very high income tracts, tracts in the top quintile of the income distribution, in the first round, 71% of movers are moving out of these very high income tracts. But by the time we get to round 6, that's decreased a lot to 38%. So that's what this pattern looks like for high income urban multifamily housing. How does it compare to suburban single family housing? Well, there's pretty much a similar pattern that we see. We see initially the moves into the newly constructed homes are less likely to be from low income tracts, but as we get to round 6, that increases quite a bit. And initially, in the first round, the movers into these new homes are more likely to be coming from top quintile income tracts, but by the time we get to round 6, that's decreased quite a bit. So what this is telling us is that vacancy chains, when they continue on long enough, they do in fact connect different submarkets. We build new housing, new high income urban multifamily housing in high income neighborhoods. Initially, most of the movers are coming from high income neighborhoods, but as the vacancy chain unfolds and we get to round 6, many more of the movers are coming from lower income neighborhoods. So that's sort of an optimistic story for new housing and suburban housing impacting housing affordability in low income neighborhoods. But one thing that's missing from this is the fact that vacancy chains are very short. So overlaid over these figures, I'm showing the density of moves, and you can see that the vast majority of moves are occurring in the first and second round, and there are very few moves at all that occur after round 3. So while, yes, if a vacancy chain continues for 6 rounds, it does in fact connect pretty disparate housing submarkets, it's very unlikely that it's going to continue on that long. And in fact, 90% of vacancy chains end within 3 rounds. So rather than characterizing vacancy chains in this way by looking at the share of movers coming from different neighborhoods in each round, another way we could look at it is asking how many vacancies are created cumulatively as the vacancy chain unfolds. So that's what's shown here, and a very different story emerges. So even though the percent of movers moving out of very high income neighborhoods is decreasing, so is the number of moves. And because of that, overall, the total number of moves or the number of vacancies created in top quintile income tracts is much higher than the number of moves or number of vacancies created in low income tracts. And another thing that you can see here is that by the time we've gotten to round 6, pretty much all of the vacancies that are going to be created have been created. So for that reason, we're going to focus on just the total number of vacancies created cumulatively by round 6 when we characterize these vacancy chains in other ways. So now moving on to sort of our main question of interest, how do these new housing types impact affordability in high density, low income neighborhoods? Again, I'm going to start with vacancy chains initiated by new high income urban multifamily housing. And what we find is that every 100 new urban units creates only 2.2 low income, high density vacancies within 1 year. So we're following these vacancy chains into those purple neighborhoods that I showed you on the map of Boston. For every 100 units in the red neighborhoods, we're getting only 2.2 vacancies in the purple neighborhoods within 1 year. If we look over a 4-year horizon, that increases to 3.1. We could also look at very high density neighborhoods. So in the 95th percentile of density, if we do that, we get 1.5 low income, very high density vacancies within 1 year for every 100 new urban units created. And that increases to 2 within 4 years. So that's not a lot of vacancies created for every 100 new units of high income urban multifamily housing. But it's more than is created by low density suburban single family housing. So looking at the number of vacancies created in those purple units by every 100 new low density suburban single family homes, we find that within 4 years, only 1.5 vacancies are created. Okay, so I know that was a lot of figures. There are 3 takeaways that I want you to have from that set of figures. The first is that vacancy chains, when they continue long enough, do in fact connect different submarkets, but vacancy chains are relatively short. That suggests that different housing submarkets are really segmented. And because of that, this point I made earlier, where we build matters for who benefits from the new housing construction. Then, because vacancy chains are so short, high income urban multifamily housing creates more vacancies in these low income urban neighborhoods than does new suburban single family housing. Okay, so those are just sort of the descriptive patterns we're seeing in the data. And now I'm going to tell you about the simulation exercise that we conduct to sort of interpret that. So conceptually, the simulation exercise is pretty simple. We're going to start by taking a model and parameter estimates from this canonical paper on residential demand by Baer, Ferreira, and McMillan. And we're going to sample households and housing units from the 1990 IPUMS. So given this set of preference parameters, housing units and households, we can compute an initial equilibrium. So this equilibrium consists of a matching of households to housing units and a set of prices that sustains that matching. So that's going to be our initial equilibrium. And then what we're going to do is we're going to iterate many times. And in each iteration, we're going to simulate building new housing in a randomly chosen neighborhood by adding 5 new housing units to that neighborhood. Because the choice set for households has changed, the housing units they have to choose from changes, that's going to imply a new equilibrium. And we're going to compute that new equilibrium as well as the new matching of households to housing units and the set of prices that sustains that matching. And the difference between this new equilibrium and the initial equilibrium, that implies a set of price effects and welfare effects that tells us who benefits from the new housing. And it also implies a set of vacancy chains. And then, since we're doing this for many, many iterations, what we can do is we can correlate the vacancy chain characteristics with the simulated price and welfare effects. And that's going to inform us on how the vacancy chain characteristics that we observe in the real data, what that implies about the price and welfare effects that we don't get to observe. So to do this simulation exercise, we're taking 10 PUMAs, which are basically large neighborhoods, sampled from the Chicago metro area. Then from each neighborhood, we're taking 100 housing units, 133 households. And then we're going to iterate 1,000 times. And in each iteration, we're going to add 5 new housing units to a single PUMA, chosen at random, in order to simulate building new housing in that neighborhood. Now, when we go through that exercise and get our initial equilibrium, one thing that's nice is that the rents that we simulate very closely match the rents that we observe in the data. And this is not sort of a mechanical relationship because the rents that we observe in the data, we never use that at any point in our simulation. Rather, the rents are simulated to sustain the matching of households to housing units. So this is nice because it tells us that our model is doing a good job of sort of replicating what we see in the real data. Some more evidence that our model is doing a good job is that households are sorting to neighborhoods in a similar way as what we observe in the data. So looking first at household income, of course, in the real data, we observe high-income households are more likely to live in high-income neighborhoods. In the simulation, when we're sort of reassigning households to neighborhoods on the basis of this model, we see a very similar pattern of sorting. And similarly for college share, we find that not only in the real data do college-educated households sort to higher college share neighborhoods, but also in our simulations, college-educated households are being sort of assigned to these high college share neighborhoods. So again, this gives us confidence that our model is doing a good job of capturing sort of the real patterns of residential sorting. So moving on to the main result of these simulations, and the takeaway is that vacancies predict price and welfare effects. So first, looking at welfare effects or looking at who benefits from new housing construction, we find that welfare effects are stronger for households who start in PUMAs that get more vacancies. So on the x-axis here, we have the number of vacancies created in a neighborhood by new housing construction. And then on the y-axis, we have the percent change in utility or percent change in well-being. And we see that as the number of vacancies created goes up, so does the increase in utility. So if you start out living in a neighborhood that gets more vacancies due to new housing construction, that implies that you're going to be better off on average because of that new housing construction than if you had lived in a neighborhood that didn't get more vacancies. This is consistent with the pattern of price effects we see, which is that price effects are stronger for homes in PUMAs with more vacancies. So houses in neighborhoods that got more vacancies, they also see a greater decrease in housing costs than housing units that started off in PUMAs with fewer vacancies. And the upshot of this is that we can use vacancy chains to understand the non-local effects of new housing. So connecting this back to what I showed you from our data, if we see that building a certain kind of housing leads to lots of vacancies in a certain housing submarket, that suggests that building that kind of housing is going to be effective at lowering housing costs in that submarket. All right, so let me conclude by sort of giving you the takeaways, and this is going to be a little repetitive of what I said before, but just to sum everything up, we find in the data that vacancy chains, when they continue long enough, do in fact connect very different housing submarkets, but vacancy chains are short, and because of that, it suggests that housing markets are really segmented. And also because vacancy chains are short, new suburban housing creates very few low-income urban vacancies per unit. From the simulation exercise, we find that the number of vacancies created in a neighborhood, that strongly predicts the price and welfare effects of that new housing construction, which suggests that we can use sort of what we readily observed in the data and use that to inform ourselves about how building some kinds of new housing impact housing costs in other housing submarkets. The policy upshot of this is what I've said a couple times now, which is that who benefits from new housing construction depends a lot on what kind of housing is built and where it's built. But some more specific policy implications are that we should be adopting policies that increase the supply of housing units that are more directly affordable to low and middle income households. So incentivizing the supply of affordable units, either with taxes or subsidies subsidies for developers or tax abatements, and also policies that reduce developer costs by maybe reforming minimum lot size requirements, and then also demand side policies that assist low income households with housing costs can help make housing more affordable for low and middle income households. We're really excited by the results that I've shared with you today. This is a work in progress, and there are a bunch of things that we still want to do to sort of increase our confidence in these results and better understand them. But for now, we think these results are really exciting and interesting. So thank you so much, and looking forward to answering some questions.
Wow. There is just so much to chew on here. We have a wealth of questions. Again, apologies. There's no way we're going to be able to get to all of them. But I think it'll also be really helpful for you as you continue down the research. So I'm going to pick through at least a couple that are both themes that have shown up or ones for whatever strike me and my colleagues. Can we start there? Several people have asked if you could connect how you're thinking about the vacancy chains with the very common concept in housing of filtering, and particularly what you would expect. You've been looking at relatively short time periods, and at least some suggestions in the questions that filtering might be a somewhat longer process. So can you just sort of connect what you've done with your understanding of the literature and discussion on filtering?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think those are both mechanisms by which theoretically building new expensive housing can ultimately increase the affordability of housing for lower and middle income households. I don't know that they're always used in a super consistent way, but my understanding is that filtering, as maybe some of the people in the chat have alluded to, is a slower process and comes from the depreciation of new housing. So you build some expensive new housing, and over time, there's just some wear and tear, and it becomes more affordable for households. But that takes quite a long time. Vacancy chains, however, are a way in which building lots of new expensive housing can have more immediate effects on affordability, and that's through this substitution effect. Maybe there are households that want to live in a dense, low-income neighborhood that's gentrifying, And in the absence of new housing construction, they'd buy up affordable housing and convert it to condos. But if you build lots of new high-end housing, maybe that sort of leads to a substitution effect that preserves those more affordable units. So those are sort of the differences in the theoretical mechanisms as I see them.
Couple of questions about the extent to which you'd find some differences, and two that jump out to me. Did you see any differences in the patterns between different types of metros? I mean, we know, some metros have a very dense urban core with a huge amount of employment or a significant share of employment in that core. Others are much more decentralized. Did the patterns differ at all by the different types of metros?
Yeah, that's another great question. And I wish I had an answer for that. That's definitely something we wanted to look at. There are just so many different ways of looking at heterogeneity in these vacancy chains. One thing that makes it a little more challenging is working with this restricted use data. There's sort of a involved process for disclosing any results, which means that we have to be pretty selective about what we release for disclosure. But that's definitely something that we want to look into more as we continue on this project.
That, by the way, answers another question you'll see, which was, does this mean that somebody can look up and see where I've lived and get all this information over all these years?
Yeah,
And
well,
clearly,
even with the restricted use data, we don't see individuals' names, just
yeah.
de-identified number. Yeah.
And did you look at, or could you look at, or will you look at whether these patterns differed by race or ethnicity? Sort of a fair housing component to this question.
Yeah, that's not something we have looked at, but it is definitely something that we'd like to look at moving forward.
I had there's a question about, you were focusing on, if I understood you right, high density, sort of new, relatively high density housing in urban areas, in the
Yeah.
affluent parts of urban areas, and single family suburban housing, particularly on the suburban fringe. It seems to me if we think about housing, there's two other common forms of housing that one might want to think about. And again, I don't know if you've been able to, or if it's in the plans, or if one would be the construction of new luxury housing in less affluent neighborhoods, right? So that the new housing is kind of a harbinger of gentrification. And the other is the really common over the last 15 or 20 years of what I think of as a more suburban multifamily, the kind of classic 5/1s that we see in lots of areas. And I don't know where did those fit into kind of your framework, or where
Yeah,
either one is.
yeah, I think those are both also really interesting kinds of new housing to look at. So one of the things I mentioned is that we were focused particularly on new multifamily housing in these high income areas because that's what's been looked at in the existing literature on vacancy chains. So it's just to have sort of a benchmark to compare our results to their results. I think for new multifamily housing, high-end multifamily housing in lower income neighborhoods, that's definitely something that's worth looking at and interesting to look at in the context of vacancy chains, but there's also a pretty large literature on, but recent literature on sort of the hyper-local effects of that kind of housing, which I think is maybe more relevant for that kind of housing, which raises fears of gentrification.
Mm.
And then for the other kind of housing, maybe sort of you could think of it as sort of gently densifying with like infill development. That's not something we've looked at yet. I agree it's worth looking at. But one of the reasons we focused on low density suburban housing, I can show you in a figure, is this figure, which shows housing stock over time for different kinds of neighborhoods. So we've got Housing built in the central city in low density neighborhoods. Housing built in the central city in high density neighborhoods. Then the solid gray is suburban housing that's high density. And then the dashed is suburban low density housing. And the focus on suburban low density housing is really motivated by this figure that shows that that has accounted for a huge increase in the country's housing stock since 1980.
Yes. And this actually is helpful. A couple of people have asked for kind of a definition of what do you consider to be high density, medium density, or low density? What are you using as benchmarks?
Yeah. So the cutoff is 1,000 people per square mile. Below that is low density. Above that is high density. So it's actually, it's very low density. If you sort of look up Google images of those kinds of neighborhoods, but that's also where a lot of the housing has been built.
It is interesting because so much of it seems that much of the policy debate right now is on, I guess, what we would think of as medium density suburbs. So if you think in Massachusetts of the MBTA Communities Act or the California law extends to all communities, but it seems like the political fire is coming in those kind of moderate density suburbs. This is totally speculative, but what's your sense, given what you've seen about low density suburbs and high density, if in fact we start building kind of more moderate density in already slightly moderate density suburbs, what kind of effect do you think that might have? Was that
So
question
building,
all clear?
maybe get it would help to hear one more time. Yeah.
Well, I was just thinking about that the push, for example, in Greater Boston right now is for the sort of inner ring suburbs, so the places that were in the gray between the areas you showed, to zone at least some of that land for multifamily, not 20-story multifamily, but probably whether it's just going to be 4 units on what were a single family lot, or a slightly larger building. But if you were to start to really build in the kind of moderate density suburbs, I mean, I guess the hypothesis would be it would be a greater impact than you saw in the low density suburbs, and not as high an impact as you might have seen in the urban areas.
Yeah, it's interesting to think about that. I think it could be. I would certainly expect it to be a higher impact than new housing in low density suburban areas, especially if we're talking about building new housing in sort of these transit corridors. But it's sort of interesting to think about, okay, if we're interested in making housing more affordable in these high density, low income neighborhoods, which submarket is closer? High income, high density neighborhoods, or sort of moderate income, medium density suburbs? It's not clear to me which kind of housing is going to be more effective at bringing down housing costs.
Well, it did seem to me that one of your findings was, if you really want to help low income households, you have to help low income households, and you have to,
Yes.
right, that any one of these is not going to have that great an impact unless you either provided the households with some form of a subsidy or done something to really bring down the cost of building the housing, or both.
Yeah, I think that's right. And just speculating, I think that new housing built in these medium density suburbs, if you're talking about like 5/1s, is more likely to be affordable for middle and low income households.
Yep. Yeah, and that was at least part of the impetus of my question. Some methodological questions about whether you're able to distinguish any differences between home ownership and rental units, both in terms of the new supply, but also the movement out of, if you look at whether you were seeing renters move or homeowners move.
Yeah. another question I wish I could answer, and something that is definitely on the to-do list. For now, we're following these vacancy chains across housing units, regardless of whether they're owner occupied or renter occupied, and not doing anything to distinguish between the two. But it would certainly be interesting to look both in terms of vacancy chains initiated by new rental housing versus owner occupied housing, and also looking at the number of vacancies created in rented units versus owner occupied units.
And I guess another methodological question, it seems like your data would not pick up kind of a gut rehab of an existing unit that may have taken it. Again, given that you were starting with high income neighborhoods, that might not have been as huge a question.
Yeah, that is something that we want to look at further as sort of like robustness check. But yeah, currently, if there's a gut rehab or a building is demolished in order to develop a new building, then we get a whole new set of housing unit IDs, and
Right.
we really capture the continuity of that chain.
Great. There's another kind of interesting methodological question about the time frame of the analysis was roughly 2008 to 2018. Is that, do I remember that
Yeah.
right? Which is sort of an interesting period because you're picking up the Great Recession, and production doesn't really start ramping up till towards the end, and is nowhere near, if we look at the last 4 or 5 years. So some question about whether or not this is what happens if you start to extend this analysis to a period when with much higher rates of construction.
Yeah. Yeah. Another thing that we'd like to disaggregate into different time periods and see if our results vary with that.
This is terrific. This is the research that just keeps on giving. I mean,
Yeah.
there's so many wonderful, I'm really serious that I think, the use of the vacancy change just allows you to, just feels like you've opened up a huge field. Back up for a second. What, if anything, were there findings that particularly surprised you in that it wasn't what you expected to find, or the magnitude of what you found was just much greater or much less than you thought you would find? Anything really jumped out for you?
Yeah, certainly how short vacancy chains are was very surprising to me. So, we found this fact that vacancy chains, if they go on long enough, they do connect these different housing submarkets. That's something that we've seen in existing work on vacancy chains. But I mean, one of our contributions is the data that we have access to, which lets us say something about how long these vacancy chains are, and is something that other papers haven't looked at. And so that was something that was new and very surprising. And I think part of the reason it's surprising is just how consequential it is.
I'm still trying to get my mind around how to understand that. So it's basically 3 moves. If I read you right. So why does it end so quickly?
Yeah. So the main reason that the vacancy chains end is that somebody leaves, but they don't leave a vacancy behind. So, like I said, you're an adult child living with your parents.
Yep.
Move into your own place, no vacancy left behind, or maybe you get a second home. There's also a case where somebody is living with roommates and they move out into their own place. Now, that's another thing that we want to look at more carefully, because you could imagine, well, it doesn't leave a vacant unit, but it leaves a vacant room in this household that somebody could occupy. So that's something we want to dig into.
Well, and your time period is sort of really as the massive millennial generation is coming of sort of household formation age. So at some level, we shouldn't be surprised and my colleague Dan McHugh has documented for years, right, the sort of changes in household formation over this time. So I guess that makes sense. Let me end with, since we love housing policy here, what's your advice? And I'm thinking that housing policy is going to get made at three different levels. So, if you were talking to somebody at the federal level, at HUD or key congressional committee, somebody at a state level, and we've seen tremendous action at the state level, and somebody at a local level, and I guess we could think either suburban or urban, take your pick, as to what in your mind are kind of the most important things that they could do to address your what was the starting question, which was how, in a way, how do we help the households, lower income households? So take
Yeah.
them in whatever order you want.
Okay. Let me start with the federal level. I think so. You put it nicely when you said sort of the takeaway of this is that if you want to help low-income households, you've got to help low-income households. And I think that sort of guides my policy recommendation, which is, expanding household choice or housing choice vouchers. So that's a demand side intervention. It's not going to boost supply, but it's important for keeping cities accessible and high opportunity neighborhoods accessible for low and middle income households, especially low income households. And on the supply side, something like expanding LIHTC, the low income housing tax credit, and policies like that. I know there have also been policies that incentivize different jurisdictions to increase affordable housing supply by sort of connecting federal grant money to how they do with that. At the local level, I think developer requirements, reforming that, I would imagine would make it much more likely that building housing that is modest and affordable to low and middle incomes would pencil out for developers. So if you're a developer and you have to include there's a minimum parking requirement and a minimum lot size requirement and all these additional things that have to be included, these big fixed costs, is really only going to make sense to build a large quantity of housing. And that quantity could be lots of space. It could be luxury amenities. So if we reduce those fixed costs, then it might be more likely that modest units will be built, sort of missing middle. And then at the state level, things that incentivize local jurisdictions to increase housing supply. I think that's the way to go.
Well, as I said, we've got many more questions than we have time. We've come to the end of our time. I think this is just, as the questions and just the general interest in the presentation testify, you've taken on, I think, a really central question. The Meyer Fellowship, which you received, and which the center's been giving out since the 1990s, is really an effort to try and identify, young scholars like yourself who are going to take on major questions. And as we've surely shown in this conversation, there are still a host of questions that are going to keep you busy for some time after you graduate. And I just really want to thank you for both taking on a really hard question, trying to answer it, I think, in a really interesting way, and then presenting your findings in ways that are really accessible. Clearly, robust research, but also, one of the keys here, which is very important to the center, is also presenting it in a way that a broader audience can really grapple with it. And as you'll see from the questions, which we'll share with you, people are definitely grappling with this. Thank you all for joining us. As I said, Our Housing Research Seminar series will wrap up next week with a presentation by Carlos Martin, and look forward to joining you. I hope you'll all join me in thanking Valentine for just a terrific presentation. Thank you so much.
Thank you, and thanks everyone for your great questions.